Does your Hatbox Ghost need to be posable? Well, have I got the joints for you. Let's pose this bad boy. Hey guys, welcome back to Prop Agenda, the channel dedicated to finding cool and inexpensive ways to making props from your favorite books, movies, TV shows, and theme park rides. We're continuing this 6-part series of how to build the Hatbox Ghost from the Haunted Mansion. In this episode, we'll look at building the movable joints of your Hatbox Ghost so you can pose them in any way you like. So if you're ready, let's get started. One of the things that's going to set this Hatbox Ghost apart is the ability to pose it. While normal PVC skeletons and armatures are static, we want our Hattie to look his best. So we need to pose him, and pose him good. The joint you're about to see me build will help us do just that. If we look at the Hatbox Ghost in the Disneyland Haunted Mansion, we notice his arm holding his cane is directly in front of him and bent at almost a 90-degree angle at the elbow and a slight bend at the wrist. The arm holding the hatbox is raised at the shoulder with a slight bend at the elbow and a fairly straight wrist. We also see bends at the hips, knees, and ankles. Well, you might be asking, Zach, why not just use all PVC connectors? There are 90 degrees and 45-degree elbows that could possibly get me there. Well, we could, but then we would be locked into that look and not get the look and positioning we wanted if we changed our mind. That's where these possible joints come in. To help us pose our figure, we're going to look at 3 different joints: hinge joints, slot and pin joints, and ball and socket joints. Our first joint is the hinge joint. This type of joint moves in a linear motion. You can use this joint to do the simplest poses. To build this joint, we use 2 pieces of 1-inch PVC. A heat gun will be used to soften the end of the PVC. Warning: when heating any PVC pipe, you need to watch for the fumes that are created. They are very toxic, and you do not want to be breathing them in. A respirator, fan, or well-ventilated space is recommended. Begin moving the heat gun around the edge of the pipe, making sure not to stay too long on any one section. We don't want to burn this thing. Once the pipe starts getting soft and shiny, it's time to flatten the edge. Place the pipe between something to flatten it out like a vise, until the pipe cools down and holds its shape. You will need to follow this method of heating and flattening for both pieces that will create your hinge. We now need to drill holes in both sections that are big enough to fit a bolt of your choosing. I used a 1024 bolt that was about 1.5 inches long. Make sure your holes are closer to the edge instead of directly centered, so the hinges don't bump against each other after they're connected. You can then use a Dremel or bandsaw to cut and curve the edges of the flattened pipe to allow it to move without catching on the other pipe edge. I used a Dremel to soften the curve of the edges a bit. The method of attachment is bolt, washer, section 1, 2 washers, section 2, washer, and a nut. I would highly recommend either using a split lock washer and nut or a nylon lock nut so you can tighten the hinge to hold its position. This is by far the cheapest method of creating a hinge. Method 2 of creating a hinge joint uses some already available items from your local hardware store. This one's a little more polished and a little more sturdy. We're going to use metal rail ends for connecting chain link fences. They can be found in the fencing section of most big box hardware stores. The ones I found were about 98 cents and fit over the top of a 1-inch PVC pipe. These are great because you don't have to heat up PVC and deal with toxic fumes. To start, drill a couple of holes into the collars of both connectors. Place the end of the PVC and mark the holes of the collars. Drill the holes into the PVC pipe and then screw them in place. Once both connectors are in place, you can create your hinge. Using the same method as we did before for the PVC hinge, run a bolt with a washer through the connector. Place 2 washers between the connector, and then another washer. Finish off with either a split lock washer and nut or a nylon lock nut. This will allow you to tighten the joint in place once you have it in the right position. This joint is sleeker looking, easier to build, and only slightly more expensive. And it's sexy as hell. Our next joint is called a pin and slot joint. It will allow our figure's limbs to pivot. Think of Hattie's feet being able to pivot inwards or outwards like a duck or a pigeon. To get started, we will need to take a 1-inch PVC coupler and cut a slot in it. This slot will need to be big enough to fit a bolt or screw of your chosen width. Once the slot is cut, file or sand out the section to make it smoother. We will also need to sand both the inside of the coupler and the outside of the 1-inch pipe we will fit inside of it. Because of the normally tight fit couplers have, we want our PVC pipe to move a little more freely. Once those items are sanded down a little, fit the PVC pipe into the coupler and drill a pilot hole for the screw or bolt to fit into. We want to make sure we drill through the first wall of the pipe. After the hole is drilled, screw your bolt with a washer into the hole. This pin will stay guided in the slot and keep the connecting arm, leg, wrist, or foot in a different angle. Once you've chosen your final angle, you can tighten the bolt down until it no longer moves, thereby locking that joint into place. Because of the Hatbox Ghost's positioning of his shoulders and legs, we're going to need a different joint that does a little more than hinges or pivots. We need full range of motion, and to get this motion, we need a ball and socket joint. The ball in this joint is going to be a golf ball. They're relatively cheap, and you can buy a box of them. That will make a lot of ball and socket joints. To get started, we want to drill a hole through the center of the golf ball big enough to fit a 2.5-inch bolt. I chose a 1/4-inch Phillips head screw to help with tightening later. We also need to countersink a hole the width of the head of the screw so it sits low enough to not affect the final joint when moving it around. Once your holes are drilled, screw the bolt into the golf ball. I chose to screw this in by hand because I obviously hate me and I like to torture myself. Once the bolt is screwed in, we can use the end of the bolt to tighten into a vise for the next step. We need to create the socket for our ball to rest in, so we are going to use our old standby, the 1-inch PVC coupler. The ball obviously can't fit into the coupler, so we will need to stretch it out a bit. To give us a little more room, use a Dremel or other cutting device to cut a slot in the coupler that goes about 1/3 of the way down. Now grab your trusty heat gun and start heating the section in around the edge of the slot and surrounding edge of the coupler. Look for it to get both shiny and soft. Once it reaches the correct softness, hammer the coupler onto the ball so that it spreads out and engulfs most of the golf ball. We want to make sure the ball doesn't reach the halfway point of the coupler because we will need another pipe into the other end. I used a clamp to keep the coupler tight on the ball, but you could also grab a damp towel and squeeze the coupler until the PVC hardens. Take the ball and socket and screw 2 nuts on to create space between the ball and socket and the next section. You will need a 1-inch PVC end cap for this section. Drill a hole into the center of the end cap that the bolt will fit through. Screw the bolt through the hole of the end cap and then use a lock washer and nut to secure it in place. Now look at that movement. Isn't it glorious? These joints can work perfectly to create a full range of motion in shoulders and hips, or any of the joints for that matter. Heck, you could use the ball and socket joints for every joint on the Hatbox Ghost. Go crazy. To make sure the ball and socket are totally tight, you could also use a pipe clamp to tighten down across it once you get it in place. And if you haven't checked out Rachel DeBarro's site, she goes a step further with these joints and applies them to full animatronic figures. She is amazing and her site is amazing, so you should check it out.
Well, that's it for now. I hope I've given you some good ideas on creating your Hattie's posable joints. Stay tuned for the next episode, where we'll look at attaching these movable joints and building the skeleton. If you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe and hit that bell so you can stay notified of upcoming videos. And make sure finding time to be creative is on your agenda.